The Greek Dark Age is the modern-day term for the period in Greek history following the Bronze Age collapse, when the Mycenaean civilization fell and the linear writing system was lost, giving the era the designation dark because no contemporary written accounts of it exist. The Mycenaean civilization and earlier Minoan civilization raised large palaces in urban centers, including Tiryns, Pylos Mycenae, and the Minoan that regulated trade and supported scribes who kept accounts and recorded the development of culture. The Mycenaeans replaced the Minoans as the major power in the Mediterranean, and when their civilization collapsed, the literate upper class vanished along with the socio-economic system they had created. Scholars Christopher Scarr and Brian M. Fagan comment, current theories of the Dark Age do not look to a wholesale replacement of the Greek population, but to a decapitation of Mycenaean society. The fall of the aristocrats with their palaces and clay tablets, leaving the uneducated villagers and farmers with only their oral traditions and village farming economy. While this may be true, the Dark Ages were not as dark as they were once thought to be. The Greek Dark Age is characterized by political fragmentation, collapse of trade networks, economic decline, loss of material culture, population decline, decline in art, cultural pursuits, wealth, and writing. In the case of the Greek Dark Age, the writing system vanished completely. Beginning in the 19th century, scholars blamed the Greek Dark Age on the Dorian invasion, claiming that Greeks, known as Dorians, destroyed the Mycenaean civilization and uprooted Greek culture for 400 years. But this has been rejected, and the Dorian invasion is now considered more of a migration. The Dark Age is also no longer thought to be so dark because Greek culture and commerce continued after the fall of the Mycenaeans, just not at the same level as before. It is now understood that the Greek Dark Age followed the Bronze Age collapse that either eliminated or adversely affected all of the civilizations of the Mediterranean, Near East. But, unlike the Hittites, the Greeks were able to survive the collapse, to emerge from their Dark Age into the Archaic period. The development of an alphabetic script and the rise of the city-states of ancient Greece, the Greek Dark Age, therefore, is now seen as more of a fallow period, leading to an abundant cultural harvest, rather than the sterile period of decay it was defined as in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Mycenaeans established over 100 urban centers throughout Greece and Anatolia, which were linked culturally, if not politically. The social structure of Mycenaean civilization is unclear, but it has been established that the palace operated on its own economy based on luxury goods, while the economic foundation of the nearby village was agricultural. The palace may or may not have controlled the economy of the village, but together they produced the goods used in trade throughout the Mediterranean. In any Mycenaean region, the palace dominated the landscape. As with Mycenae, built on a hill 278 meters, the wealth of the palace was contrasted with that of the village, where the people lived in mud brick houses built on foundations of stone without ornamentation, lacking any kind of records. It is unknown how prosperous the villagers were. But after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, this no longer mattered, as those mud brick houses were all that survived intact. The Bronze Age collapse is a modern-day term for the widespread and rapid decline of civilizations in the Mediterranean and Near East, beginning c. 1200 BCE. The causes of the collapse include natural catastrophes, climate change, internal rebellions, invasions, disruption of trade relations, systems collapse. All of the above have been cited as causes for the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization and the Greek Dark Age. Political instability may have resulted from class wars between the people of the village and those of the palace over the inequitable distribution of wealth. Though this claim is speculative, Climate change and natural catastrophes, as well as invasions by the sea peoples who were instrumental in the fall or decline of other civilizations such as the Hittites and Egyptians, seem to be more certain causes. Scholar Bettany Hughes, among others, cites greed, which encouraged war, as the primary cause of the Mycenaean collapse. The city birthed a particular kind of self-contained civilization and incarnated the self-destructive paradox of what it is to be civilized. The pressing desire for more, for what we do not have. And so, the rulers of the Aegean Bronze Age got greedy. Peering over the horizon, they saw not just another citadel state like theirs, but potential plunder. There were triumphs, and then there was tragedy. It is unclear what actually happened, however, and all that is clearly known is that the great palaces and production centers of the Mycenaeans abruptly declined between c. 1230 and c. 1100, when several of these sites were destroyed, some bearing the marks of fire, while others remained untouched but were abandoned. These latter sites were sometimes repopulated, but on a far more modest scale. The sites of the so-called post-palatial period provide no evidence of the kind of opulent wealth of the Mycenaean era. Those who lived in the abandoned palace complexes and those who continued living in the mud-brick houses surrounding them seem to have been at the same economic level. There is no evidence, in the early part of the Dark Age anyway, of long-distance trade, and ceramics show a marked decline in style. There is no evidence of a writing system of any kind, and agricultural production declined, as did the population. The entire civilization of ancient Greece seems to have paused for approximately 200 years before it began again. Yet in those 200 years, there were clearly significant developments that enabled the kind of industry, trade, and expansion seen from c. 1050 to 800 BCE. Following the Bronze Age collapse, no monumental stone structures were built, and, as noted, those that were not destroyed declined and were inhabited, seemingly, by squatters. The relationship between the decline in agricultural production and the decline in population continues to be debated, but it seems that the lack of basic foodstuffs encouraged the population decline, which in turn hampered food production. This is a generalization. However, as some regions, including Attica and Euboea, continued more or less as they had before, only at a more modest level. As noted, the relationship between the palace and the village during the Mycenaean era is unclear, but during the Dark Age, the village came to be centered around a strongman, who became the authority as noted by scholar Thomas R. Martin. In the Dark Age society, men dominated the distribution of justice, exercising direct control over their family members and household servants. Others outside their immediate households would become their followers by acknowledging their status as leaders. A powerful man's followers would grant him a certain amount of authority, because, as the followers were roughly equal in wealth and status among themselves, they needed a figure invested with authority to settle disputes and organize defense against raids or other military threats. In anthropological terms, such leaders operated as chiefs of bands. A chief had authority to settle arguments over property and duties, oversaw the distribution of rewards and punishments, and usually headed the religious rituals deemed essential to the security of the group. At the same time, his actual power to coerce recalcitrant or rebellious members of his band was limited. The chief's authority was granted by the males of the band he presided over, and if he abused his position or was in some way no longer regarded as worthy of his position, he was replaced. This social paradigm is known through Hesiod, who described it in his works and Days. Precisely when this model was implemented is unknown, but by Hesiod's time, it seems to have been firmly in place and would eventually develop into the concept of kingship and, in Athens, democracy. During the early Dark Age, There were no cities for a king to rule over, however, and no armies to send on campaigns of conquest. The village leader organized defense against, or mobilization of raids on, other villages. By the 10th century BCE, however, significant changes are evident in social development, as Scar and Fagan note. For several centuries, Greece remained a basically peasant society, without cities, without writing, and without architecture of any significance. Yet as early as the 10th century BC, there were signs of economic revival. This cultural and economic recovery, continuing during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, had both domestic and international components. At home, population levels that had fallen dramatically at the end of the Mycenaean Age began to rise once again, and prosperity grew. Overseas, there were renewed contacts with the ports around the eastern Mediterranean, and luxury items from Egypt and Cyprus were placed in graves at Lefkandi, on the Greek island of Euboea. In the 1960s, the now famous site of Lefkandi on Euboea was discovered, revealing an ancient Greek settlement dated to c. 1200 to c. 950 BCE. The site features a number of cemeteries, with grave goods that established trade between Euboea, Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. Lefkandi is a prime example of a community that seems to have been relatively unaffected by the Greek Dark Age. Based on the large, excavated structure known as the Hero's Grave, the community seems to have been led at some point around 950 BCE by a powerful, wealthy chieftain, and, possibly, his wife. Who they were and how they came to rule is unknown, but it is clear they were important members of an elite aristocratic class, at a time when the concept of an aristocracy seems to have been forgotten. Martin comments. We can only speculate about the various ways in which families might have originally gained their designation as elite, and thus become entitled to pass on this wealth and status to those descendants able to maintain them. Some families in the Dark Age might have inherited an elite status as survivors of prominent families of the Mycenaean Age that had somehow managed to hold on to wealth or land during the early Dark Age by amazing wealth, and befriending less fortunate people who were willing to acknowledge their benefactors' superior status in return for material help. And some might have acquired superior social status by monopolizing control of essential religious rituals that they perpetuated for others to participate in. The ideas and traditions of this social elite concerning the organization of their communities and proper behavior for everyone in them, that is their code of values. Represented like the reappearance of agriculture, basic components of Greece's emerging new political forms. The social values of the Dark Age underlie the stories told in the Iliad and Odyssey. The male remains in the hero's grave were cremated, wrapped in cloth, and interred in an engraved bronze amphora from Cyprus. He was buried with a sword and elaborate grave goods. The woman buried with or after him was adorned with jewelry and an ivory-handled knife. The grave and the building constructed over it suggest significant wealth, more in keeping with the Mycenaean era than the Dark Age. And so, as noted, this marks Lefkandi as one of the sites that seems to have weathered the collapse of c. 1200 BCE, at least rebounded more quickly than others. For much of Greece by c. 950 BC, the world of the Mycenaeans had become a golden age of heroes and gods, far removed from their daily lives. Writing had been rediscovered through trade with Phoenician merchants, and the stories told of the great age of heroes, kept alive through oral tradition, were set down by Homer in the 8th century BCE. Martin comments. The Greeks had relearned the technology of writing as a result of contact with the literate civilizations of the Near East, and the alphabet developed there long before. Sometime between 950 and 750 BC, the Greeks adopted a Phoenician alphabet to represent the sounds of their own language. innovating in a fundamental way by introducing vowels as letters. The Greek version of the alphabet eventually formed the base of the alphabet used for English today. Greeks of the Archaic Age swiftly applied their newly acquired skill to write down oral literature, such as the Iliad and Odyssey. The Greeks believed that Homer, a blind poet from the region of Anatolia called Ionia, had composed the Iliad and Odyssey. Homeric poetry, even if it was put into final form by a single author, grew out of centuries of oral performance by countless Greek poets singing of the deeds and values of legendary warriors and their families. Despite the ancient origins of Homeric poetry, the behavioral code portrayed in its verses primarily reflected values established in the society of Greece of the Dark Age before the rise of political systems based on citizenship. The main characters in the Homeric poems are unmistakably members of the social elite, who are expected to live up to a demanding code of values. The heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey, Agamemnon, Achilles, Menelaus, Odysseus, and others were modeled on the Dark Age chieftains, combined with the images of the wealth and power of the Mycenaean period. Hesiod, in the section of works and days given as the ages of man, compares his era unfavorably with the earlier Golden Age, which was nobler and more righteous. A godlike race of hero men, who are called demigods, the race before our own. In writing of his own time, he comments, "Thereafter, would that I were not among the men of the 5th generation, but either had died before or been born afterwards. For now, truly is a race of iron, and men never rest from labor and sorrow by day, and from perishing by night, and the gods shall lay sore trouble upon them." The Greek Dark Age was, in fact, a race of iron. As iron came to replace bronze, long-distance trade was required in making bronze, but iron was plentiful from the mines of Greece. According to Hesiod, iron was as inferior to bronze as the people of his time to the heroes of the Homeric poems. The Greek alphabet developed from the Phoenician script at some point around the 8th century BCE. The earlier Mycenaean linear script, used primarily for lists and inventories, had been lost during the Greek Dark Age, and the technology of the written word remained unavailable until the invention of the alphabet, which influenced the later Latin script. The basis for the writing system known as the alphabet came from the Near East, specifically the Levant, but, as scholar Barry B. Powell points out, these earlier systems were not the alphabet. From an historical point of view, alphabet and Greek alphabet are one and the same. The Greek alphabet was the first writing that informed the reader what the words sounded like, whether or not he knew what the words meant. The word alphabet itself is Greek, formed from the Greek names of the first two signs in the series Alpha and Beta. Earlier writings, including such West Semitic writings as Phoenician and Hebrew, were in this sense not alphabets. All later alphabets, the Latin or Cyrillic, or the International Phonetic Alphabet, are modifications of the Greek alphabet, having the same internal structure, unlike the Mycenaean Linear B script, which seems to have served a primarily utilitarian function. The alphabet was quickly used in preserving the literary oral tradition by writing down the Iliad and the Odyssey, and religious traditions as recorded by Hesiod in his all three dated to the 8th century BCE. New works were also created, however, such as Hesiod's works and days, and inscriptions such as the one from Nestor's cup. Among the earliest extant examples of Greek writing, from the 8th century BCE onwards, the Greek alphabet was used to produce all of the famous works of the civilization on topics ranging from astronomy and astrology to botany, biology, creative writing, literary criticism, history, the medical arts, philosophy, science, sociology, veterinary medicine, and zoology, among many others, standardizing knowledge and allowing for further developments. The Greek alphabet was adopted by the Etruscans and transmitted by them to the Romans, who used it to develop the Latin script, which became the basis for modern alphabetic scripts. The Mycenaean civilization developed over 100 urban centers across Greece and Anatolia and kept records through the writing system known as Linear B script. Linear B developed from the Linear A script of the Minoan civilization, but as Linear A remains undeciphered, their relationship is unclear. Linear B was a syllabic script consisting of over 80 signs and 100 ideas. A syllabic script, as the name suggests, represents the syllables of a word through these characters. The signs providing phonetic and referential meaning, and the ideograms, the subject matter and quantity. A line of Linear B would give the signs up front, the subject and quantity, but could not convey a need for 25 sheep. Consequently, the script was only used for official records of the Mycenaean palace complexes and inventory and trade. There is no written Mycenaean literature because they did not have a writing system capable of expressing complex thoughts or concepts. Even though they clearly had such thoughts, as shown through the archaeological evidence of their religious practices, the Mycenaean civilization fell during the Bronze Age collapse, initiating the Greek Dark Age, during which Linear B was lost. However limited the script may have been, it still provided a written record of the activities of the people, which was no longer possible during the Dark Age. Reconstruction of daily life in ancient Greece during this period relies entirely on archaeological evidence or works from other civilizations of the Near East. At some point between 800 to 700 BC, the alphabet was introduced to the Greeks by the Phoenicians, but how this happened is unclear. Herodotus provides the best-known version of the event. The Phoenicians who came to Greece with Cadmus ended up living in this land and introducing the Greeks to a number of accomplishments, most notably the alphabet, which, as far as I can tell, the Greeks did not have before then. At first, the letters they used were the same as those of all Phoenicians everywhere, but as time went by, along with the sound, they changed the way they wrote the letters as well. At this time, most of their Greek neighbors were Ionians, so it was the Ionians who learnt the alphabet from the Phoenicians. They changed the shapes of a few letters, but they still called the alphabet. They used the Phoenician alphabet, which was only right, since it was the Phoenicians who had introduced it into Greece. Powell, among others, dismisses this account as nascent historical thinking, seeking to place past human events in real time and mythologizing the event through the figure of Cadmus, the great Phoenician hero prince who founded the writers before and after Herodotus give their own versions of the birth of the Greek alphabet, some, like the Latin writer Gaius Julius attributing it almost wholly to the work of the gods and fates, but the general consensus is its Phoenician origin. Powell comments, Phoenician writing consists of a signary of 22 syllabic signs, each of which designates a consonant plus an unspecified vowel, of obscure origin, but usually thought to descend from Egyptian. The script was fully developed by 1000 BC, when it spread without differentiation to Hebrew Palestine and soon after to Aramaic-speaking Syria and northern Mesopotamia. The simple syllabary replaced, in many areas, the cumbersome logosyllabic Akkadian cuneiform scripts, long supported by the ruling elite of Bronze Age civilization. Cuneiform, invented by the Sumerians c. 3500 BCE, and refined c. 3200 BC, had 600 characters in its simplest form. It is easy to understand, therefore, why a more concise writing system would have been welcomed and would eventually replace it. Scholars Christopher Scarr and Brian M. Fagan comment on the development of the system that became the Greek alphabet. The idea of alphabetic components first appeared in inscriptions found in Sinai, known as and dated to c. 1700 BC. These took Egyptian, hieroglyphics as a basis but used a small selection of the full range of hieroglyphic signs to form the letters of an alphabet. The language of the inscriptions was not Egyptian but Canaanite, and it was in the Levant that the subsequent development of the alphabet took place. By the 11th century BC, a fully developed version of this early alphabet was being used by the Phoenicians. The Israelites and Arameans adopted and adapted the Phoenician alphabet in the 9th century BC, and the Greeks adopted it from Phoenician merchants in the 8th century. However, the initial transfer of information took place. It is thought it involved a Greek who was well acquainted with the Phoenician written script and was able to make whatever adjustments thought necessary to develop the script for use by the Greeks. This may have included adding vowels and 2 letters to bring the total number up to 24 from 22, or this development may have come later. Once the script was mastered, it was used to record far more than lists of inventory. The oral tradition of Greece developed during the Dark Age and featuring tales of the creation of the world, the birth of the gods, and the adventures of great heroes could now be committed to written form, and this seems to have happened fairly quickly after the alphabet was introduced to the Greeks. Scholar Thomas R. Martin comments, "Knowledge of writing was the most dramatic contribution of the ancient Near East to Greece as the latter region emerged from its Dark Age. The Greeks probably originally learned the alphabet from the Phoenicians to use it for record-keeping in business and trade, as the Phoenicians did so well, but they soon started to employ it to record literature, namely Homeric poetry, since the ability to read and write remained unnecessary for most purposes in the predominantly agricultural economy of archaic Greece, and there were no schools. Few people at first learned the new technology of letters. Those who write the stories, however, shape the culture, and it did not matter whether one could read the pages of Homer because one could hear the stories read, watch their recitation, and through this participation, however passive, absorb the cultural values encouraged by the literate social elite." Martin notes, "The ideas and traditions of this social elite concerning the organization of their communities and proper behavior for everyone in them, that is their code of values. Represented like the reappearance of agriculture basic components of Greece's emerging new political forms, the social values of the Dark Age elite underlie the stories told in the Iliad and Odyssey, 2 book-length poems that first began to be written down about the middle of the 8th century BC at the very end of the Dark Age. At about this same time, the poet Hesiod composed his Theogony on creation, the birth of the gods, and their genealogy, and, sometime after this, wrote the first autobiographical poem in Greek literature, Works and Days, invoking the gods to take his side against unjust judges and laws that favored his brother, Perses, over the author in a dispute regarding ownership of the family farm. Although earlier civilizations had produced autobiographical works, these were not available to the Greeks. As Powell notes, what about the literature that went before? Couched in the writings of the immemorially old, splendid civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, these literate civilizations flourished 2,500 years before Homer and gave much to Hellas. In technical and material culture, how much of their literate culture was transferred to Greece? The answer is little or none. The Greeks simply could not read the writings of pre-Greek peoples. The works of Homer and Hesiod, while not new from a global historical perspective, were completely novel to the Greeks. The influence the Greek alphabet had on the development of Greek culture was enormous, even if, as noted, most of the population was illiterate during the Archaic Age. The alphabet introduced the people to worlds presented by writers they would never meet, and it allowed for endless possibilities of word combinations in shaping these worlds for a particular effect. Sometimes the same effect: elevation, enlightenment, and understanding. The Iliad and Odyssey are epic book-length poems, the Theogony a little over 1,000 lines, works and days almost 900 lines. But among the earliest examples of the Greek alphabet is a 3-line inscription on the drinking vessel known as Nestor's cup, which could be considered the first beer commercial in history. Who am I? None other than the luscious drinking cup of Nestor. Drink me quickly, and be seized in lust by golden Aphrodite. On the simplest level, the inscription suggests a narrative still used in advertising in the present day. Drink this beer and get the beautiful woman, but by identifying the vessel as Nestor's cup, it also invites the drinker to associate himself with Nestor, the wise king of Pylos from the Iliad, and by that association, with all the other great Homeric heroes, gods, and goddesses, just as the Iliad and Odyssey might elevate the hearts and minds of the hearers, so might this inscription of only 3 lines. The cultural impact of these works, which owed their existence to the alphabet, was immense. Scholar Thomas Cahill comments, a writing system of some 20 odd characters meant that anyone might learn to read, even a child, a woman, or a slave. What empowerment this implied, especially when considered against earlier systems. One needed to know Hebrew well in order to read it confidently. If Hebrew was not your mother tongue, you would always be guessing which vowel sounds to supply between the consonants. But written Greek, because of the addition of vowels, required no subjective judgment or interpretation. It was completely objective, completely out there, completely distinct from the reader. Just as the simplicity of alphabetical writing made possible general access to literacy, which in its turn encouraged democratic give, the utter objectivity of the Greek alphabet encouraged the demystification of the world. As the alphabet allowed one to build on lessons of the past, it encouraged the development of philosophical, scientific, medical, religious, political, cultural, and social systems. In Greece, the concept of democracy was already understood and practiced during the Dark Age, but during the Archaic and Classical Ages, it developed into a recognizable system of government. A type of literacy that can be grasped easily by almost anyone will tend to spread some kind of protodemic consciousness far and wide, even if this is accomplished only in small steps over a very long period of time. A type of literacy that demystifies the act of reading, erasing for all time the aura of an unapproachable sacred brotherhood of scribes, wise, and potentates, will by its very nature tend to demystify additional realms of human experience. The Greek alphabet, later adopted by the Etruscans, and then the Romans, became the basis for the modern-day alphabet, and so, the modern paradigm of what constitutes objective reality. Prior to the alphabet, a narrative concerning the life of the state or community might take many forms depending on the memory of the speaker and their particular interpretation. Afterward, stories became standardized, accepted as truth, and known as history. Discoveries, or novel ideas, whose transmission previously relied on one's proximity to the innovator, could now be understood over both distance and time, allowing for further development in multiple disciplines. Before the alphabet, there was only opinion. Afterwards, there was fact. Greek mythology was used as a means to explain the environment in which humankind lived, the natural phenomena they witnessed, and the passing of time through the days, months, and seasons. Greek myths were also intricately connected to religion and explained the origin and lives of the gods, where humanity had come from, and where it was going after death. Greek myths gave faces and characters to the gods of the Greek religion, but they also gave people helpful practical advice on the best way to lead a happy life. Another purpose of myths was to retell historical events, so that people could maintain contact with their ancestors, the wars they fought, and the places they explored. In modern usage, the term myth perhaps has negative connotations, suggesting a lack of authenticity and reliability. However, it should not be assumed that myths were wholeheartedly believed in, nor should it be assumed that the Greeks were wholly skeptical of them. Probably, the Greek myths, as with any religious or non-written sources, were believed by some and discounted by others. Myths were certainly used for religious and educational purposes, but also may well have had a simple aesthetic function of entertainment. What is certain is that the myths were both familiar and popular with a wide section of Greek society through their common representation in art, whether that be sculpture on public buildings or scenes painted on pottery. Without widespread literacy, the passing on of myths was first done orally, probably by Minoan and Mycenaean bards from the 18th century BCE onwards. This of course allows for the possibility that with each retelling of a particular myth, it is embellished and improved upon to increase audience interest or incorporate local events and prejudices. However, this also is a modern interpretation, for it is also possible that the telling of myths followed certain rules of presentation, and a knowledgeable audience may not have willingly accepted ad hoc adaptations to a familiar tale. Over centuries, though, and with increasing contact between cities, it is difficult to imagine the local stories did not become mixed with others to create a myth with several diverse origins. The next development in the presentation of myths was the creation of poems in Ionia, and the celebrated poems of Homer and Hesiod around the 8th century BC. For the first time, mythology was presented in written form. Homer's Iliad recounts the final stages of the Trojan War, perhaps an amalgamation of many conflicts between Greeks and their eastern neighbors in the late Bronze Age, and the Odyssey recounts the protracted voyage, home of the hero Odysseus, following the Trojan War. Hesiod's Theogony gives a genealogy of the gods, and his works and days describes the creation of man. Not only are gods described with typically human feelings and failings, but also heroes are created, often with one divine parent and the other mortal, thus providing a link between man and the gods. The next principal representation of myths was through pottery from the 8th century BCE onwards. A myriad of mythical scenes decorate ceramics of all shapes and function, and must surely have spread the myths to a wider audience. Greek mythology continued to be popular through the centuries, and major public buildings, such as the Parthenon at Athens, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and the Temple to Apollo at Delphi, were decorated with larger-than-life sculpture representing celebrated scenes from mythology. In the 5th century BCE, the myths were presented in the new format of theatre, especially in the works of the three tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. At the same time, from the 6th century BCE, the first documented skepticism and even rejection of the myths began with the philosophers who searched for a more scientific explanation for phenomena and events. Finally, in the 5th century BCE, the first historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, sought to document as accurately as possible and record for posterity a less subjective view of events, and so the modern subject of history was born. Broadly speaking, The imaginative Greeks created myths to explain just about every element of the human condition. The creation of the world is explained through two stories, where a son usurps the place of his father Kronos from Uranus and Zeus from Kronos, perhaps referring to the eternal struggle which exists between different generations and family members. The Olympian gods, led by Zeus twice, defeated the sources of chaos, represented by the Titans and the giants. These gods then rule man's destiny and sometimes directly interfere, favorably or otherwise. Indeed, the view that events are not human-esque to decide is further evidenced by the specific gods of fate and destiny. A further mythological explanation of the seemingly random nature of life is the blind god Pluto, who randomly distributes wealth. The gods also illustrated that misdemeanors would be punished, e.g., Prometheus for stealing fire and giving it to man. The origin of other skills such as medicine and music are also explained as divine gifts. For example, Apollo passing on to his son Asclepio's medicinal knowledge for man's benefit. Finally, certain abstract concepts were also represented by specific gods, e.g. justice, peace, and lawfulness. The heroes, the most famous being Hercules, Achilles, Jason, Perseus, and Theseus, but including a great many more, all have divine parents, and therefore bridge the gap between mortals and gods. These popular heroes pursue fantastic adventures and epitomize ideal qualities such as perseverance, e.g. Hercules' 12 labors, or fidelity, e.g. Penelope waiting faithfully for Odysseus' return. Heroes also added prestige to a city by being credited as its founder, e.g. Theseus for Athens, Perseus for Mycenae, or Cadmus for Thebes. The heroes and events such as the Trojan War also represented a past golden age when men were greater and life was easier. Heroes then were examples to aspire to, and by doing great deeds, a certain immortality could be reached, either absolutely or through commemoration in myth and tradition. In contrast, many mythological figures represent qualities to be avoided, and their sad tales illustrate the dangers of bad behavior. King Midas, for example, was granted his wish that everything he touched turned to gold. But when he found out that this included food and drink, his avarice almost resulted in his death from starvation and thirst. The myth of Narcissus symbolizes the dangers of vanity after the poor youth fell in love with his own reflection, and he lost the will to live. Finally, the story of Croesus warns that vast riches cannot guarantee happiness when the fabulously rich king misinterpreted the Delphic oracle and lost his kingdom to Persia. Natural phenomena were explained with myth. Earthquakes are created when Poseidon crashes his trident to the ground, or the passage of the sun is Helios in his chariot riding across the sky. Myths such as Persephone's half-year descent to Hades explained the seasons. Time itself had mythological explanations. Helios' 7 herds of 350 cattle correlate to the days of the year. Selene's 50 daughters are the weeks, and Helios' 12 daughters the hours. Greek mythology also includes a number of monsters and strange creatures, such as the one-eyed Cyclops in the Odysseus story, a gigantic boar in the fabled Caledonian hunt, Sphinx, giant snakes, fire-breathing bulls, and more. These creatures may represent chaos and lack of reason. For example, the centaurs, half-man and half-horse, fierce and fantastic creatures, often emphasize the difficulty of the tasks. Heroes are set, for example, the many-headed Hydra to be killed by Hercules, the Gorgon Medusa whose look could turn you into stone and whom Perseus had to behead, or the Chimera, a fire-breathing mix of lion, goat, and snake, which Bellerophon killed with the help of his winged horse Pegasus. Alternatively, they may represent the otherworldliness of certain places. For example, the three-headed dog Kerberos, which guarded Hades, or simply symbolized the exotic wildlife of distant lands visited by Greek travelers. Perhaps unfamiliar experiences were also explained in myth. For example, one can imagine that a Greek visiting King Minos' sophisticated and many-roomed palace at Knossos might have thought it a labyrinth, and the worship thereof bulls, and the sport of bull-leaping might be the source of the Minotaur. Is it coincidence it was killed by the visiting Athenian Theseus? Could Jason's expedition for the Golden Fleece be a reference to the rich gold of the Caucasus, and a Greek expedition to plunder this resource? Do the Amazons represent an encounter with another culture where women were treated more equally than in the Greek world? Do the Greek myths of the sirens and Charybdis warn of the dangers of travel beyond familiar territory? Such questions may well remain unanswered. But starting with the discovery of Troy in the 19th century CE, archaeological finds have steadily contributed an ever-growing body of physical evidence, which illustrates that the oral traditions and stories from Greek mythology had an origin and a purpose they were not previously credited with. From around 800 BCE, ancient Greek city-states, most of which were maritime powers, began to look beyond Greece for land and resources. As a consequence, they founded colonies across the Mediterranean. Trade was usually the first step in the colonization process, and then, after local populations were subdued or included within the colony, cities were established. These could have varying degrees of contact with the homeland, but most became fully independent cities, sometimes very Greek in character. In other cases, culturally closer to the indigenous peoples they neighbored and included within their citizenry. One of the most important consequences of this process, in broad terms, was that the movement of goods, people, art, and ideas in this period spread the Greek way of life far and wide to Spain, France, Italy, the Adriatic, the Black Sea, and North Africa. In total, then, the Greeks established some 500 colonies, which involved up to 60,000 Greek citizen colonists, so that by 500 BC, these new territories would eventually account for 40% of all Greeks in the Hellenic world. The Greeks were great seafarers, and traveling across the Mediterranean, they were eager to discover new lands and new opportunities. Even Greek mythology included such tales of exploration as Jason and his search for the Golden Fleece, and that greatest of hero travelers Odysseus. First, the islands around Greece were colonized. For example, the first colony in the Adriatic was Corcyra, founded by Corinth in 733 BCE, and then prospectors looked further afield. The first colonists in a general sense were traders, and those small groups of individuals who sought to tap into new resources and start a new life away from the increasingly competitive and overcrowded homeland. Trade centers and free markets were the forerunners of colonies proper. Then, from the mid-8th to mid-6th centuries BC, the Greek city-states and individual groups started to expand beyond Greece with more deliberate and longer-term intentions. However, the process of colonization was likely more gradual and organic than ancient sources would suggest. It is also difficult to determine the exact degree of colonization and integration with local populations. Some areas of the Mediterranean saw fully Greek palaeus established, while in other areas there were only trading posts, composed of more temporary residents such as merchants and sailors. The very term colonization infers the domination of indigenous peoples, a feeling of cultural superiority by the colonizers, and a specific cultural homeland which controls and drives the whole process. This was not necessarily the case in the ancient Greek world, and therefore, in this sense, Greek colonization was a very different process from, for example, the policies of certain European powers in the 19th and 20th centuries CE. It is perhaps here, then, a process better described as culture contact. The establishment of colonies across the Mediterranean permitted the export of luxury goods such as fine Greek pottery, wine, oil, metalwork, and textiles, and the extraction of wealth from the land, timber, metals, and agriculture, for example, and they often became lucrative trading hubs and a source of slaves. A founding city might also set up a colony in order to establish a military presence in a particular region and so protect lucrative sea routes. Also, colonies could provide a vital bridge to inland trade opportunities. Some colonies even managed to rival the greatest founding cities. Syracuse, for example, eventually became the largest polis in the entire Greek world. Finally, it is important to note that the Greeks did not have the field to themselves, and rival civilizations also established colonies, especially the Etruscans and Phoenicians, and sometimes, inevitably, warfare broke out between these great powers. Greek cities were soon attracted by the fertile land, natural resources, and good harbors of a new world. Southern Italy and Sicily. The Greek colonists eventually subdued the local population and stamped their identity on the region to such an extent that they called it Greater Greece, or Megel, and it would become the most Greek of all the colonized territories, both in terms of culture and the urban landscape, with Doric temples being the most striking symbol of Hellenism. Some of the most important palaeas in Italy were Cumae Nexos, Sybaris, Croton Tarentum Regium, Ilia Thuri. On Sicily, the main colonies included Syracuse, Gela Salanus, Himera. The geographical location of these new colonies in the center of the Mediterranean meant they could prosper as trade centers between the major cultures of the time, the Greek, Etruscan, and Phoenician civilizations, and prosper they did. So much so that writers told of the vast riches and extravagant lifestyles to be seen. Empedocles, for example, described the pampered citizens and fine temples of Acragas in Sicily as follows. The Acragantinians revel as if they must die tomorrow, and build as if they would live forever. Colonies even established offshoot colonies and trading posts themselves, and, in this way, spread Greek influence further afield, including higher up the Adriatic coast of Italy. Even North Africa saw colonies established, notably Cyrene by Thera in c. 630 BC, and so it became clear that Greek colonists would not restrict themselves to Magna Graecia. Greeks created settlements along the Aegean coast of Ionia from the 8th century BCE. Important colonies included Miletos, Ephesos, Smyrna, and Halicarnassus. Athens traditionally claimed to be the first colonizer in the region, which was also of great interest to the Lydians and Persians. The area became a hotbed of cultural endeavor, especially in science, mathematics, and philosophy, and produced some of the greatest of Greek minds. Art and architectural styles, too, assimilated from the East, began to influence the homeland. Such features as palmed column capitals, sphinx, and expressive, orientalizing pottery designs would inspire Greek architects and artists to explore entirely new artistic avenues. The main colonizing polis of southern France was Phasaea, which established the important colonies of Alalia and Massalia. The city also established colonies, or at least established an extensive trade network, in southern Spain. Notable palaeas established here were and Rhodes. Colonies in Spain were less typically Greek in culture than those in other areas of the Mediterranean. Competition with the Phoenicians was fierce, and the region seemed always to have been considered, at least according to the Greek literary sources, a distant and remote land by mainland Greeks. The Black Sea was the last area of Greek colonial expansion, and it was where Ionian Palaeus, in particular, sought to exploit the rich fishing grounds and fertile land around the Hellespont and Pan. The most important founding city was Miletos, which was credited in antiquity with having a perhaps exaggerated 70 colonies. The most important of these were Kyzikos-Sinope. Olbia Megara was another important mother city, and founded Byzantium and Heraclea. Eventually, almost the entire Black Sea was enclosed by Greek colonies, even if, as elsewhere, warfare, compromises, and diplomacy had to be used with indigenous peoples in order to ensure the colony's survival. In the late 6th century BCE, particularly, the colonies provided tribute and arms to the Persian Empire and received protection in return. After Xerxes' failed invasion of Greece in 480 and 479 BCE, the Persians withdrew their interest in the area, which allowed the larger Peleus like Pontique and Sinope to increase their own power through the conquest of local populations and smaller neighboring Peleus. The resulting prosperity also allowed Heraclea to found colonies of her own in the 420s BCE at such sites as Chersonesos in the Crimea. From the beginning of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, Athens took an interest in the region, sending colonists and establishing garrisons. An Athenian physical presence was short-lived, but longer-lasting was an Athenian influence on culture and trade. With the eventual withdrawal of Athens, the Greek colonies were left to fend for themselves and meet alone the threat from neighboring powers such as the Royal Scythians and ultimately Macedon and Philip II. Most colonies were built on the political model of the Greek polis, but types of government included those seen across Greece itself: oligarchy, tyranny, and even democracy, and they could be quite different from the system in the founder, parent city. A strong Greek cultural identity was also maintained via the adoption of founding myths and such widespread and quintessentially Greek features of daily life as language, food, education, religion, sport, and the gymnasium. Theatre, and with its distinctive Greek tragedy and comedy plays, art, architecture, philosophy, and science, so much so that a Greek city in Italy or Ionia could, at least on the surface, look and behave very much like any other city in Greece. Trade greatly facilitated the establishment of a common Greek way of life. Such goods as wine, olives, wood, and pottery were exported and imported between Peleus. Even artists and architects themselves relocated and set up workshops away from their home polis, so that temples, sculpture, and ceramics became recognizably Greek across the Mediterranean. Colonies did establish their own regional identities, of course, especially as they very often included indigenous people with their own particular customs, so that each region of colonies had their own idiosyncrasies and variations. In addition, frequent changes in the qualifications to become a citizen and forced resettlement of populations meant colonies were often more culturally diverse and politically unstable than in Greece itself, and civil wars thus had a higher frequency. Nevertheless, some colonies did extraordinarily well, and many eventually outdid the founding Greek superpowers. Colonies often formed alliances with like-minded neighboring Peleus. There were, conversely, also conflicts between colonies, as they established themselves as powerful and fully independent. Peleus, in no way controlled by their founding city. Syracuse in Sicily was a typical example of a larger polis, which constantly sought to expand its territory and create an empire of its own. Colonies, which went on to subsequently establish colonies of their own and who minted their own coinage, only reinforced their cultural and political independence. Although colonies could be fiercely independent, they were at the same time expected to be active members of the wider Greek world. This could be manifested in the supply of soldiers, ships, and money for Panhellenic conflicts, such as those against Persia and the Peloponnesian War, the sending of athletes to the great sporting games at places like Olympia and Nemea, the setting up of military victory monuments at Delphi, the guarantee of safe passage to foreign travelers through their territory, or the export and import of intellectual and artistic ideas such as the works of Pythagoras, or centers of study like Plato's Academy, which attracted scholars from across the Greek world. Then, in times of trouble, colonies could also be helped out by their founding polis and allies, even if this might only be a pretext for the imperial ambitions of the larger Greek states. A classic example of this would be Athens' Sicilian expedition in 415 BCE, officially at least, launched to aid the colony of. There was also the physical movement of travelers within the Greek world, which is attested by evidence such as literature and drama. Dedications left by pilgrims at sacred sites, like Epidaurus, and participation in important annual religious festivals such as the Dionysia of Athens. Different colonies had obviously different characteristics, but the collective effect of these habits just mentioned effectively ensured that a vast area of the Mediterranean acquired enough common characteristics to be aptly described as the Greek world. Further, the effect was long-lasting, for, even today, one can still see common aspects of culture shared by the citizens of southern France, Italy, and Greece. Greek architecture is concerned with simplicity, proportion, perspective, and harmony in buildings. Greek architecture includes some of the finest and most distinctive buildings ever built. Examples of Greek architecture include temples, theaters, and all of which become common features of towns and cities from antiquity onwards. Greek architects would go on to greatly influence architects in the Hellenistic period and in the Roman world, providing the foundation for the classical architectural orders which would dominate the Western world from the Renaissance to the present day. The classical architectural orders. There are 5 orders of classical architecture: Ionic, Corinthian, Tuscan, and Composite, all named as such in later Roman times. Greek architects created the first 3 and hugely influenced the latter 2, which were composites rather than genuine innovations. An order, properly speaking, is a combination of a certain style of column, with or without a base, and the earlier use of wooden pillars eventually evolved into the Doric column and stone. This was a vertical fluted column shaft, thinner at its top, with no base and a simple capital below a square abacus. The entablature frieze carried alternating triglyphs and The Ionic order, with origins in mid-6th century BCE Asia Minor, added a base and volute, or scroll capital, to a slimmer, straighter column. The Ionic entablature often carries a frieze with richly carved sculpture. The Corinthian column, invented in Athens in the 5th century BC, is similar to the Ionic, but topped by a more decorative capital of stylized acanthos. These orders became the basic grammar of Western architecture, and it is difficult to walk in any modern city and not see examples of them in one form or another. The Greeks certainly had a preference for marble, at least for their public buildings. Initially, though, would have been used for not only such basic architectural elements as columns, but the entire buildings themselves. Early 8th century BCE temples were so constructed and had thatch roofs. From the late 7th century BCE, temples, in particular, slowly began to be converted into more durable stone edifices. Some even had a mix of the 2 materials. Some scholars have argued that certain decorative features of stone, column capitals and elements of the entablature evolved from the skills of the carpenter displayed in more ancient, wooden architectural elements. The stone of choice was either limestone protected by a layer of marble dust stucco, or even better, pure white marble. Also, carved stone was often polished with chamois to provide resistance to water and give a bright finish. The best marble came from Naxos, Paros, and Mt Pentelikon near Athens. The ancient Greeks are rightly famous for their magnificent Doric and Ionic temples, and the example par excellence is undoubtedly the Parthenon of Athens. Built in the mid-5th century BCE in order to house the gigantic statue of Athena and to advertise to the world the glory of Athens, it still stands majestically on the city's Acropolis. Other celebrated examples are the massive Doric Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, and the evocative Temple of Poseidon at Susa, perched on the cliffs overlooking the Aegean. The latter is illustrative of the Greek desire that such public buildings should not just fulfill their typical function of housing a statue of a Greek deity, and not only should they be admired from close-up or from the inside, but also that they should be admired from afar. A great deal of effort was made to build temples in prominent positions, and using sophisticated geometry architects included optical tricks, such as thickening the lower parts of columns, thickening corner columns, and having columns ever so slightly lean inwards, so that, from a distance, the building seemed perfectly straight and in harmony. Many of these refinements are invisible to the naked eye, and even today only sophisticated measuring devices can detect the minute differences in angles and dimensions. Such refinements of architectural style indicate that Greek temples were, therefore, not only functional structures, but also that the building itself, as a whole, was symbolic and an important element in the civic landscape. Greek temples, at least on the mainland, followed a remarkably similar plan, and almost all were rectangular and that is, their exterior sides and facades consisted of rows of columns. Notable exceptions included the magnificently eccentric Erechtheion of Athens, with its innovative caryatid columns, and the temples of the Cyclades, although still Doric, only had columns on the front facade, which was often wider than the length of the building. So too, temples from Ionia tended to differ from the norm, usually having a double colonnade. However, returning to the standard Greek temple layout, the rectangular peristyle of columns surrounded an inner chamber or cellar with the whole standing on a stepped platform or stylobate, and the interior paved with rectangular slabs. The roof was usually raised along a central ridge, with a slope of approximately 15 degrees, and was constructed from wooden beams and rafters, covered in overlapping terracotta or marble tiles. Decorative acroteria often stood at each point of the pediment. Finally, the doors to temples were made of wood and often decorated with bronze medallions and bosses. Many temples also carried architectural sculpture arranged to tell a narrative. Pediments, friezes, and metopes all carried sculpture, often in the round or in high relief, and always richly decorated, which retold stories from Greek mythology or great episodes in that particular city's history. Temples also indicate that Greek architects were perfectly aware of the problems of providing stable foundations, able to support large buildings, correct water drainage, and the use of continuous bases on foundations above various layers of fill material, allowed Greek buildings to be built in the best positions, regardless of terrain, and to withstand the rigors of weather and earthquake, overset. Indeed, absolute stability was essential, as even a slight settling or in any part of the building would render useless the optical refinements discussed above. It is remarkable that the vast majority of Greek buildings that have collapsed have done so only because of human intervention, removing blocks or metal fixtures for reuse, ELSEWHERE, weakening the overall structure. Structures not interfered with, such as the Temple of Hephaestus in the Athens Agora, are testimony to the impressive durability of Greek buildings. Other structures which were constructed near temples were monumental entrance gates, and small buildings to house dedications, often from specific These very often borrowed architectural elements from the temple, such as columned facades and friezes. An excellent example is the treasury of the Athenians at Delphi. The stoa was another structure common to many temple complexes from the 7th century BCE onwards. This was a long, narrow row of columns backed by a plain wall and roofed, often placed at right angles to create an enclosed open space. Stoas were used for all manner of purposes, such as meeting places and storage. The agora, or marketplace, of many ancient Greek towns would be composed of a large open square surrounded by a stoa. One unusual stoa is that of the Sicilian colony of Selinus. This was constructed between 580 and 570 BCE and was a trapezoid in shape. More interestingly, the nearby shops all present the same facade, despite being different types of buildings. This is evidence that there was some sort of centrally controlled planning authority which ensured harmony of architecture in important public places. Certainly, during the 5th century BCE, there were professional town planners, the most famous of which was Hippodamos, who is often credited with planning the Piraeus and Rhodes. Interestingly, there is very often a correspondence between architectural changes in towns and changes in political regime. One final function of the stoa in Hellenistic times was in the gymnasium and palestra complex, notably at the great sanctuaries of Olympia and Nemea. These stoas were used to create an enclosed space for physical exercise and provide a practice area for such field events as the javelin and discus. Temples, treasuries and stoas then, with their various orders, arrangements of columns and architectural sculpture, have provided the most tangible architectural legacy from the Greek world, and it is perhaps ironic that the architecture of Greek religious buildings has been so widely adopted in the modern world for such secular buildings as courthouses and government buildings. Another distinctive contribution of Greek architecture to world culture was the amphitheatre. The oldest certain archaeological evidence of theatres dates from the late 6th century BCE, but we may assume that Greeks gathered in specified public places much earlier. Indeed, Bronze Age Minoan sites, such as Phaistos, had large step courts, which are thought to have been used for spectacles such as religious processions and bull-leaping sports. Then, from the late 6th century BC, we have a rectangular theatre-like structure from Thorikos in Attica, which had a temple dedicated to Dionysus at one end. This would suggest it was used during Dionysiac festivals, at which dramas were often presented. However, it was from the 5th century BCE that the Greek amphitheatre took on its recognizable and most influential form. This was an opener and approximately semicircular arrangement of rising rows of seats, which provided excellent acoustics. The stage or orchestra was also semicircular and backed by a screen or skene. Monumental arches often provided the entrances on either side of the stage. Examples abound throughout the Greek world, and many theatres have survived remarkably well. One of the most celebrated is the Theatre of Dionysus, Eleutherius, on the southern slope of Athens' Acropolis, where the great plays of Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes were first performed. One of the largest is the Theatre of Argos, which had a capacity for 20,000 spectators. And one of the best preserved is the Theatre of Epidaurus, which continues every summer to host major dramatic performances. Theatres were used not only for the presentation of plays, but also hosted poetry recitals and musical competitions. Another lasting contribution of Greek architecture to world culture was the stadium. Stadiums were named after the distance of the foot race they originally hosted. The stade, or state, initially constructed near natural stadia, evolved into more sophisticated structures with rows of stone, or even marble steps for seating, which had divisions for ease of access. Conduits ran around the track to drain off excess rainfall, and in Hellenistic times, vaulted corridors provided a dramatic entrance for athletes and judges. Famous examples include those at Nemea and Olympia, which had seating capacities of 30,000 and 45,000 spectators respectively. Considering more modest structures, there were fountain houses in many Greek cities where people could easily collect water and perhaps, as black figure pottery scenes suggest, socialize. Regarding private homes, these were usually constructed with mud brick, had packed earth floors, and were built to no particular design. 1- or 2-storied houses were the norm. Later, from the 5th century BCE, better houses were built in stone, usually with plastered exterior and frescoed interior walls. Also, there was often no particular effort at town planning, which usually resulted in a maze of narrow, chaotic streets. Even in such great cities as Athens, colonies in Magna Graecia, as we have seen in Selinus, were something of an exception and often had more regular street plans. No doubt a benefit of constructing a town from scratch. In conclusion, then, we may say that ancient Greek architecture has provided not only many of the staple features of modern Western architecture, but it has also given the world truly magnificent buildings, which have literally stood the test of time and continue to inspire admiration. And many of these buildings, the Parthenon, the caryatid porch of the volute of an Ionic capital, to name just 3, have become the instantly recognizable and iconic symbols of ancient Greece.